Hey guys, tonight we step into a place where the air smells faintly of incense, roasted lamb drifting from unseen kitchens, and damp stone corridors holding secrets in their chill. The year is 1362, in the heart of the Ottoman palace at Bursa, just as the empire begins to stretch its limbs into Europe and flex its power across Anatolia. You stand where men of steel and ambition shape dynasties, where prayers echo from mosques newly raised, and where, behind latticed windows, women's voices hum softly like rivers hidden beneath marble. This is the cradle of the Ottoman Harem, not yet the sprawling Topkapi labyrinth it would later become, but something smaller, rawer, and filled with anticipation. You probably won't survive this if you mouth off to the guards, so maybe keep your head down and try not to look too curious. If the title pulled you in, the first concubine of the Ottoman Harem, you've come to the right place. Tonight you'll follow her footsteps, how she was chosen, how she lived, how she shaped not just the Sultan's nights but the empire's mornings. Before we dive deeper, drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know from which corner of the world you're eavesdropping on these palace walls. Settle in, relax, and let's slip past the guards and curtains together. This is history, whispered in candlelight, and tonight it's all about the very first concubine of the Ottoman Harem. You trudge through the narrow, winding streets of Bursa, capital of a young empire. The Ottomans are still consolidating power. Riding high after Orhan Gazi, the second ruler, has expanded their lands and left behind a dynasty hungry for legitimacy. His son, Murad Athas, is now steering the ship, and you can feel the weight of ambition in every mosque rising from the skyline. Inside the palace, far more modest than the grand halls that would later define Istanbul, lies the beginning of something both intimate and political. The harem. The harem, at this early stage, isn't yet a fortress of hundreds of women from across the empire. It's embryonic, closer to a private household than a fully institutionalized system. But here, the seeds are planted. The Ottomans didn't invent the concept. They inherited threads from Persian, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions. The Abbasids had harems, the Seljuks had harems, and the Byzantines, whose lands the Ottomans were swallowing, kept courts filled with concubines and ceremonial wives. The Ottomans stitched these influences together, embroidered them with their own pragmatism, and created something uniquely imperial. And at the center of this first experiment in Ottoman seclusion was one woman, the first concubine officially tied to the Sultan's private chambers. Her identity is not neatly preserved. Historians debate her name. She may have been Greek or perhaps from the Balkans, captured in one of the early raids across Thrace. Maybe she was a gift from a provincial governor seeking favor, or a slave purchased in Bursa's bustling market. What matters most is not her birthplace, but the role she carved for herself. The template of a system that would grow into a world of whispers, politics, and gilded cages. You walk with her in imagination now, barefoot across cold tiles, the hem of her robe brushing stones smoothed by years of footsteps. She enters a world both luxurious and suffocating. Servants teach her Turkish, recite verses of the Quran, correct the way she bows, the way she pours water, the way she lowers her gaze in front of the Sultan. In these early years, the harem is not yet the vast labyrinth where hundreds compete for favor. It's smaller, almost familial, and that intimacy means the first concubine's role is sharper, more visible. Every gesture she makes is noticed. Every word she utters could ripple outward into palace politics. Now imagine you're her, plucked from one life, thrust into another. You carry with you a strange blend of fear and opportunity. The Ottomans need legitimacy, not just land and soldiers, but heirs. And the production of heirs doesn't fall on the battlefield, but within these veiled chambers. The first concubine knows this. Her body, her womb, is suddenly tied to the destiny of an empire still unsure of its permanence. The Sultan, Murad I, is a man of both war and devotion. He spends his days plotting campaigns against the Serbs and Bulgars, but his nights lead him back here, to the woman chosen to share his most private space. Their intimacy is not just personal, it's political theatre. A sultan's concubine, especially the first, is not simply a lover, she is a cornerstone of dynastic stability. If she bears him a son, she shapes succession. If she bears a daughter, she strengthens marriage alliances. If she fails, her influence evaporates like incense smoke. You stand in her chamber now. The room is sparse compared to later Ottoman splendor. A low bed draped with embroidered linen, oil lamps flickering shadows across painted wooden walls. A small chest with silks folded carefully inside. There is no gilded dome, no fountains singing in marble courtyards yet. Still, for a woman who began outside these walls, this is opulence. She eats pomegranates and honey when others beyond the palace gates chew stale bread. She wears imported silk while peasants wrap themselves in wool. But luxury comes chained with isolation. She cannot leave without permission, cannot speak to men outside without risk, cannot write letters unless supervised. The harem's structure, though embryonic, already enforces rules. Eunuchs, castrated guardians brought from Africa and Central Asia, patrol the corridors, their job to secure, to silence, to ensure no rival man enters this space. For the first concubine, every movement is watched. Privacy exists only in imagination. Still, she learns to navigate it, to whisper when guards are distracted, to gesture subtly when words could be overheard. The art of survival here is an art of quiet. One evening, as Murad returns from prayer, she pours water over his hands, the ritual of ablution before sleep. The water is scented faintly with rose petals, luxury distilled into liquid. He watches her, weighing her grace, her obedience, her ability to calm his battle-worn mind. In that look, her future is sealed. She is not simply a servant. She is the first chosen woman of the Ottoman dynasty's inner sanctum. For you, standing in this dim corridor, the enormity of her role sinks in. She is not just a figure in silk. She is the hinge upon which succession, power, and legitimacy turn. If she births a son, that son could someday rule the empire. If she whispers counsel, it might sway a decision of war or peace. Through her, the empire is not just built on steel and prayer, but on intimacy, on breath shared in the quiet hours of the night. The streets outside still buzz with traders calling, donkeys braying, and the clang of blacksmiths shaping tools. But within these walls, another forge is lit, one that shapes destiny through women, through silence, through the delicate balance of affection and politics. And it all begins here, with her, the first concubine of the Ottoman Harem. The Ottomans would refine this system over centuries. Later sultans would preside over harems housing hundreds, where mothers of princes wielded enormous political power as valued sultan. But without this first concubine, without her role as the initial mold, the system might have evolved differently. She represents the origin point, the moment where private desire met public power and fused into a unique Ottoman institution. You lean back now, eyes half closed, picturing her seated by the lattice window, hearing the echo of drums from a distant military parade. She touches the carved wood gently, perhaps remembering the world outside she may never walk freely again. Her fate is tied to the Sultan's whims, but in the quiet, she is more than his companion. She is history's quiet architect, a nameless woman whose steps you followed tonight through shadowed corridors. The walls around you hold that memory. They remind you that history is not just about kings and battles, but also about the silent figures who shaped dynasties from behind veils. And as you drift deeper into this story, know that the path ahead through training, hierarchy, rivalries, and eventual decline is paved by her presence. You slip deeper into the palace, past the flicker of torches against the stone, and now the question becomes, how did this entire concept, the harem, even take root in Ottoman soil? To understand the first concubine, you have to understand the foundations of the space she entered, and those foundations were a blend, a cocktail shaken from centuries of precedent, stitched together by the Ottomans in their restless rise from a frontier principality to a dynasty with imperial ambition. The word itself, harem, comes from the Arabic harem, meaning forbidden or sacred. It wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Earlier Islamic dynasties had secluded women's quarters, both for privacy and for social control. The Abbasids in Baghdad ran harems as sprawling, glittering fortresses of women and politics. The Seljuks of Anatolia, who had ruled before the Ottomans, also maintained secluded courts. where women were kept apart from public gaze. Even further west, Byzantines, those perennial rivals and neighbours, filled their palaces with court women, empresses, and attendants, living in carefully policed seclusion. The Ottomans didn't just borrow the idea, they fused it with their own needs, sharpening it into a tool of both legitimacy and survival. Picture the early Ottomans in the 14th century. They were expanding fast, conquering towns, villages, and cities that had been under Byzantine or Balkan rule. With every conquest came captives. Some were sold in markets, some sent as tribute, and some, the most beautiful or promising, were offered up as gifts to the Sultan's household. This wasn't just about desire, it was about politics. To take the daughters of rivals, to fold them into the fabric of the palace, was to weave control over conquered lands. And so the earliest harems were as much symbols of power as they were intimate spaces. But the Ottomans had another problem. Unlike some dynasties, they didn't rely heavily on royal marriages to cement alliances, marrying off princesses to foreign kings, as the Byzantines had often done, wasn't their style. Instead, the Ottomans preferred concubines, women without formal political ties outside the empire. Why? Because if a sultan married a princess from another kingdom, that foreign family might later claim a say in Ottoman politics. Concubines, usually slaves or captives without dynastic baggage, carried no such danger. Their children would belong entirely to the dynasty, unentangled from external claims. It was both ruthless and clever. The harem also tied neatly into Islamic tradition, at least as interpreted by Ottoman jurists. Concubinage was legal under Islamic law, provided the women were captives or slaves, and children born from them were considered legitimate. This distinction was critical. It meant that the sons of concubines were just as legitimate heirs as sons of legal wives. Over time, this practice hardened into an Ottoman norm. Sultans stopped marrying altogether and relied exclusively on concubines for producing heirs. And that shift, that decision to draw dynastic bloodlines from women with no outside political loyalties, began right here, with the first concubine. Now, pause and picture her stepping into this structure. She wasn't entering a personal love story. She was stepping into a centuries-old system refined for empire. Behind the incense and silks, the harem's origins were pragmatic, almost bureaucratic. It was a machine designed to secure heirs, to guard the dynasty from outside meddling, and to create a space where women could be controlled yet cultivated for influence. The first concubine's existence inside the palace was proof that this machinery had switched on. And the Ottomans didn't just inherit architecture and laws, they inherited stories. Whispers from Persian courts about queen mothers guiding policy, from Abbasid Baghdad about concubines who wielded influence, from Byzantine Constantinople about empresses who plotted in shadow. These stories filtered into Ottoman imagination, and you can almost hear the unspoken thought, why shouldn't we do the same, but better? The harem in these early decades wasn't yet the grand Topkapi complex that tourists snap pictures of today. In Bursa, it was a simpler household arrangement. Rooms grouped together, screened off from the men's quarters, guarded by eunuchs. Women moved in these narrow corridors like water trickling through stone channels. Their lives were secluded, but not idle. Each woman represented potential, a potential alliance, a potential heir, a potential influence, and standing at the center was the first concubine, the initial thread in a web that would eventually stretch across centuries. For you, walking these corridors in your imagination, it might feel like a contradiction. On one hand, the harem is a cage, walls closing in, guards watching every move. On the other, it's a stage, a place where women could rise to power, wield influence, even steer imperial policy. But that paradox is exactly why the system endured. The harem confined, yet it also created its own internal hierarchies, where women competed, schemed, and sometimes triumphed. The Ottomans, like any good administrators, gave this paradox structure. Rules evolved. A concubine could only bear one son. Why? Because if a woman birthed multiple princes, she could gather too much power around herself, tipping the balance. By restricting concubines to one son each, the dynasty ensured competition. Princes scattered among different mothers, mothers balancing against each other. It was cold calculus, but it worked to keep the imperial household from becoming a monopoly of influence, and it meant that the first concubine, if she bore Murad of Fursanan, would be elevated, but never allowed to dominate unchecked. The presence of eunuchs added another layer. These men, castrated before entering service, became the literal guardians of the harem. They controlled access, managed correspondence, enforced discipline. Their loyalty was to the sultan. But over time, they too became power brokers, whispering in ears, deciding who got an audience. In these early days, their numbers were few, but the model was clear. The harem was not just about women and silk, it was about men without families who became gatekeepers, ensuring the system remained sealed. Step back a moment and glance at the empire outside these walls. The Ottomans are pushing into the Balkans. Murad I will soon fight at Kosovo, carving his name into the chronicles of Europe. Soldiers march, mosques rise, taxes are collected, and in the middle of this whirlwind, the Sultan retreats at night into the harem, where the first concubine waits. Her role is not less important than the generals, the viziers, or the judges. She is the hinge on which succession rests. Without her, the dynasty risks fracture. With her, it can project legitimacy into the future. And yet, remember, she is also a woman, not an abstract role, not a machine part. She laughs at some private joke, whispered by a maid. She feels the weight of silks too hot for summer. She watches through a screen as parades pass outside, aching for the freedom to walk in open air. These human details are often lost in the cold architecture of history, but they matter because the institution of the harem was lived, day by day, by women who breathed, hoped, feared, and endured. By now, you can sense how the harem's origins, legal, cultural, political, come together into something distinctly Ottoman. It is Islamic law blended with pragmatic dynastic strategy. It is Persian tradition fused with Byzantine inheritance. It is personal desire shackled to public duty, and the first concubine embodies that fusion. She is not simply a captive turned companion. She is the living proof that the empire has chosen its path. Heirs born of concubines, dynasties secured by secluded women, politics carried out behind screens as much as on battlefields. If you tilt your ear, you can almost hear the echo of centuries ahead. Roxolana, Kosem Sultan, Torhan Sultan, women who would one day dominate Ottoman politics from within the harem's walls, but all of them stand on the shoulders of this first, nameless figure. Without her, the system would not have crystallized. Without her, the Ottomans might have pursued alliances through foreign princesses, and history might have taken a different turn. You lean against the palace wall now, the stone cool under your fingers. Outside, the city of Bursa hums with life, but here, in the quiet corridors, a revolution is happening in silence. The creation of the harem is not just a detail of palace life, it is a structural decision that will shape centuries, and at its heart, the first concubine, silent, watched, yet essential, steps forward into history. You can almost hear the clatter of hooves on the stones outside Bursa's markets, the shouts of vendors hawking spices, silks and copperware, but hidden within the palace, the atmosphere is different, quieter, calculated, because now we turn to the question of how women like the first concubine were actually selected. She did not simply stroll in and charm her way to the Sultan's chambers. No, she was chosen, sifted, measured against a checklist of imperial needs. The Ottomans had many sources for the women who would fill their harems. Some were gifts. Governors, eager to stay in the Sultan's favor, would send the most beautiful women they could find. Others were captives, taken in the never-ending cycle of raids and wars on the Byzantine frontier or across the Balkans. Slave markets too played their role, where Circassian, Georgian and Balkan girls were sold, sometimes by their own desperate families. She likely stood out in some way. Beauty, of course, mattered. Chroniclers speak of fair skin, bright eyes, long hair as prized qualities, but intelligence mattered too. The Ottomans were not looking for silent ornaments alone. They wanted women who could learn languages, absorb courtly etiquette, and understand subtle politics. Selection was only the beginning. Once brought into the palace, a woman went through layers of observation. She was washed, clothed in palace silks, and set under the supervision of experienced attendants. The Ottomans believed that refinement could be taught, but only if the raw material was good, and so the chosen concubines were tested. Could they carry themselves with elegance? Did they show quick wit in learning Turkish Arabic prayers or Persian poetry? Did they handle silks and perfumes with the right delicacy? Every misstep was noted. Now, imagine yourself in her skin. You arrive in a new world. Strange language, strange food, strange smells of musk and rosewater. Your clothes are stripped away. You are dressed in robes of silk that feel both luxurious and alien. Servants drill you in posture. Walk with your back straight. Bow without fumbling. Sit with composure even when your legs ache. They teach you to play the oud or tambur, to sing softly in Turkish melodies. The first concubine's selection was more than a private event. It was the start of a political system. She was the first piece of a chessboard that would eventually fill with rivals, allies, and power brokers. But in these earliest years, she likely felt more alone than supported. There was no large community of women yet, just a few attendants, maybe another companion or two. Her role was not cushioned by a hierarchy, but sharpened by its absence. All eyes turned to her as the prototype. The Ottoman sultans understood the importance of appearances. When a concubine was selected, she was not hidden away at once. Ceremonies were sometimes staged, parades of sorts, where the chosen women were displayed in silks, jewels glittering under torchlight. This spectacle served two purposes. It showed off the wealth of the dynasty, and it reminded subjects that the sultan commanded not only armies, but also the most beautiful women of the empire. For the first concubine, this meant her arrival was both intimate and public. She might have been paraded through Bursa's palace courtyard, her head bowed but her presence announcing, "The sultan's household has begun." Of course, not every woman selected for the harem reached the sultan's chambers. Many remained attendants, entertainers, or ladies in waiting. Only a few, the most refined, made it to the inner circle. The first concubine's journey to that inner circle was therefore remarkable. It meant she had passed every test, from beauty to etiquette to intelligence, and had been deemed worthy of the sultan's gaze. The Ottomans were also pragmatic about bloodlines. While marrying foreign princesses was avoided, there was still value in taking concubines from noble families of conquered lands. If the first concubine was, as some sources hint, of Byzantine or Balkan origin, her presence symbolized the submission of those lands. To have a Christian noblewoman serve in the harem, convert to Islam, and bear the sultan's child was the ultimate political statement. The Ottomans were not just conquering lands, they were folding their rivals into their very bloodline. Selection also involved a touch of mysticism. The Ottomans, deeply religious, often believed dreams or omens accompanied the choice of a concubine. Chroniclers tell of sultans dreaming of women with radiant faces, and the next day, that very woman being brought into the palace. Whether true or not, these stories added a divine aura to the selection process. The first concubine, therefore, was not just a woman but a figure wrapped in destiny. Her arrival reshaped the palace. Servants adapted routines to accommodate her. Guards increased vigilance around her chambers. Musicians played softer tunes in the evenings. Even the architecture began to shift. Rooms were redesigned, partitions erected, creating the first outlines of what would become the imperial harem. The selection of one woman had architectural consequences, a reminder that private choices of rulers ripple outward into stone and mortar, and the people noticed. In Bursa, word spread quickly. The Sultan had chosen his first concubine. For ordinary citizens, it was a sign of stability. A sultan with a concubine meant heirs were coming, and heirs meant continuity. Dynasties without heirs were fragile, always at risk of collapse. The selection of the first concubine reassured subjects that the Ottoman line would endure. Now, think of her again, alone in a chamber perfumed with rosewater, the sounds of drums echoing faintly from the city. She must have felt both trapped and elevated. She was no longer a free woman, but neither was she a nameless servant. She was the axis on which the dynasty spun. Every step she took in those marble halls set a precedent for hundreds of women who would follow, And as you drift further into this picture, remember, the selection was not just about her, it was about empire. The Ottomans had made a choice, institutionalizing concubinage as their path to legitimacy. That choice began with her, the first concubine. Selected not only for beauty or grace but for what she symbolized, the future of the Ottoman throne. The palace grows quieter after night prayers, the distant hum of Bursa's markets finally dimming to silence. Oil lamps flicker in the corridors, their shadows trembling across the walls, and now we come to the moment when the first concubine actually entered the heart of Ottoman power, her official arrival as the Sultan's chosen companion. This step was more than a private affair, it was a ceremonial crossing, one that sealed her fate and announced the beginning of a dynasty's most intimate tradition. The first concubine's entry into the palace did not unfold like a romantic tale. There were no flowers scattered across her path, no serenades under moonlight. Instead, there was ritual, control, and the unmistakable weight of expectation. She was led through guarded gates by eunuchs, their eyes cold and impassive, their hands resting on the hilts of curved blades. Behind her, the city of Bursa, its mosques, its bustling stalls, its streets filled with gossip, faded into memory. Ahead of her lay silence, a new language of gestures and veils, and the watchful eyes of the Sultan himself. In those days, the palace was not the sprawling Topkapi of Istanbul, with its labyrinth of courtyards and chambers. It was smaller, more contained, but no less intimidating. The first concubine's entry meant she passed from the outer household, where servants and guards lived, into the inner sanctum. This threshold mattered. Beyond it, life was no longer her own. She belonged now to the Sultan, and by extension to the empire. Think of the scene. Her robe rustles against stone floors polished by countless feet. Eunuchs walk ahead, carrying lanterns that glow like embers in the dark. At the doorway of the women's quarters, attendants wait to receive her, women who had already been serving in the palace, perhaps cooks, seamstresses, or lesser concubines, still in training. They bow slightly, not to her but to the unseen authority she now represents. She is not just another girl, she is the first concubine, the one who sets the example. Their eyes follow her as she is guided deeper inside. Before she is allowed to rest, rituals unfold. She is bathed in warm, perfumed water, the steam rising into curls that soften the stone walls. Her hair is combed, her nails trimmed, her body anointed with rose oil. This cleansing is not only practical but symbolic, a washing away of her past life, a rebirth into the role she now inhabits. She is dressed in fresh silks, layered and embroidered, far heavier than the clothes she wore before. Gold-threaded slippers are placed on her feet. A jeweled veil is draped lightly over her hair. By the time the ritual ends, the woman who entered Erman the outside world has vanished. In her place stands a figure crafted for the palace, a concubine of the Ottoman dynasty, and then comes the audience. She is led, slowly, into the Sultan's private chamber. The room is dim, lit only by oil lamps casting golden halos onto carpets woven with patterns of flowers and vines. The air smells of musk, sandalwood, and the faint smoke of extinguished candles. Murad-I, the Sultan, sits waiting. He is not a young man of careless desires, but a ruler hardened by campaigns and responsibilities. His gaze is heavy, his voice measured. He studies her as she kneels, her forehead nearly touching the carpet. For a moment silence hangs between them, a silence filled with centuries of tradition pressing into this single moment. When he raises his hand, she looks up, careful not to hold his gaze too long. Words are few, gestures speak more loudly. He might ask her name, though he knows it will be replaced soon by one chosen within the palace. He might ask about her origins, though he already understands she was selected precisely because her past ties posed no threat. What matters is not who she was, but who she is now, the first companion of the Ottoman Harem. From this night forward, her status changes. She is no longer simply a concubine in training, waiting to be noticed. She is the chosen one, the woman who has crossed the invisible line that separates the outer circle from the Sultan's bed. Other women will serve her now. Eunuchs will guard her chamber with renewed vigilance. Her meals will be finer, her robes richer, Her voice, though still quiet in the corridors, will carry more weight. She is, in effect, the queen of a kingdom within walls, but her position is precarious. Intimacy with the Sultan brings both privilege and danger. If she pleases him, her influence grows. If she falters, she may be discarded without ceremony. Returned to the shadows of the harem, for now she balances on a knife's edge. Her every gesture, every word, a test she cannot afford to fail. Imagine her waking the morning after her first night in the Sultan's chamber. Dawn light filters through latticed windows, casting honeycomb patterns on the floor. Outside, the muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. She stretches in silence, aware that her movements are already part of palace gossip. Servants bow as they bring her water for ablution, trays of figs, dates and warm bread. She eats slowly, knowing eyes are watching. Already, whispers circulate through the harem. She has been chosen. She is the first. Some whisper with envy, others with awe, but all recognize the new reality. Her background still clings to her, though the palace works to erase it. If she was Greek or Balkan, she might still think in her native tongue when she dreams. But during the day, she must speak Turkish, recite Quranic verses, and sing Ottoman songs. Conversion is expected, she learns quickly, not just to please the Sultan, but to survive. Every mispronounced word, every hesitation in prayer, is noted by attendants eager to report faults. Her success depends on mastering the identity forced upon her. This transformation is not only spiritual, but political. By accepting her role, she becomes a symbol of conquest. If she is a daughter of Byzantium, her presence in Murad's chamber is proof that the old empire is fading, its bloodlines folded into Ottoman veins. If she is Balkan, her fate mirrors that of her homeland, subdued and redirected toward the service of the dynasty. She is both woman and metaphor, a living embodiment of Ottoman expansion. Yet within this symbolism she remains a human being. She laughs quietly at some joke whispered by a maid. She presses her hand against the cold stone window ledge, longing for the open air beyond. She feels the weight of her silks as both honor and burden, and though she carries the destiny of heirs on her shoulders, she still thinks of simple things. The taste of honey on her tongue, the warmth of a blanket at night, the sound of the city alive beyond the walls she may never freely walk again. Her entry into the palace also shifts the Sultan's image. To have a concubine is to show virility, to promise continuity. Courtiers whisper that Murad is wise, securing his dynasty early. Subjects take comfort in the knowledge that heirs will soon be born. Foreign envoys, hearing of the concubine's arrival, report back that the Ottomans are solidifying their household, preparing for generations of rule. Her private entrance ripples outward into public perception, strengthening the Sultan's legitimacy without a single word spoken in the open. And so the first concubine settles into a new reality. She learns the rhythms of the palace, the call to prayer, the hum of recited Quran at dawn, the clatter of dishes in the kitchens, the quiet conversations in the baths. At night, she waits for the Sultan, never certain if he will come. Some nights he arrives, weary from council meetings or military plans, and she soothes him with music, stories, or silence. Other nights he stays away and she lies awake staring at the carved beams of the ceiling, wondering if her favor is already slipping. This tension defines her existence. She has been elevated above all other women, yet she remains vulnerable, her future balanced on the Sultan's shifting moods. But for now, in these earliest days, her position is secure. She is the first concubine of the Ottoman Harem, the template upon which centuries will be modelled. When you picture her now, seated on a low cushion, fingers tracing the rim of a brass bowl filled with rosewater, remember that this moment is more than personal. It is historical. Her entry marks the beginning of an institution that would shape not just the private lives of sultans, but the politics of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Her presence in that chamber is as significant as any treaty, any battle, any coronation. She is the first, and everything begins with her. The palace is never still for long. Even when the streets of Bursa fall silent, the harem hums quietly like a hive behind its walls. Now that you've seen the first concubine's entry, It's time to step into her world of training and palace life, the education that transformed her from a captured or gifted woman into a polished figure capable of standing beside the Sultan. Because make no mistake, intimacy alone was never enough. The harem trained women like soldiers, not for battlefields but for survival, for influence, and for the subtle arts of pleasing both ruler and court. The training began the moment she was chosen. Once the first concubine entered the inner household, she was not immediately secure. To keep her position and to build on it, she had to undergo instruction in language, etiquette, religion, and artistry. This was the Ottoman court, and refinement mattered as much as loyalty. A clumsy gesture or an ignorant word could undo everything. Language was always the first barrier. The empire stretched across lands filled with Greek, Slavic, Albanian, Armenian, and Arabic tongues. The first concubine, if she was from the Balkans, might have known little or no Turkish. Tutors were appointed to teach her quickly the Sultan's language, the court's idioms, the religious vocabulary of the Quran. She would repeat phrases late into the night, correcting her accent until the words rolled from her tongue like water. Turkish became not only her survival tool, but her gateway to belonging. Religion followed close behind. Conversion to Islam was expected, though it was often framed as part of the harem's education rather than forced overnight. The first concubine would have been taught the daily prayers, guided by older women who recited slowly, ensuring she could mimic the rhythm. Ritual purity became part of her daily routine. Ablution before prayer, the modest arrangement of robes, the lowering of eyes in reverence. In this way, she was reshaped not only as a concubine, but as a Muslim companion to the Sultan, aligning her presence with divine legitimacy. Etiquette was perhaps the most demanding. The Ottoman court prized elegance and restraint. Every movement was rehearsed. She was taught to pour sherbet without spilling a drop, to bow with just the right depth, to rise gracefully from cushions, to sit in silence when superiors spoke. Even her laughter was measured. It had to be soft, dignified, never coarse. The harem was filled with rules invisible to outsiders, rules that created a choreography of obedience and beauty. A woman who mastered them seemed effortless, but in truth, every gesture had been drilled like a soldier's salute. Music and poetry filled the rest of her education. The Ottomans adored art, and sultans prided themselves on their refined tastes. The first concubine would learn to pluck the strings of the oud or the tambour, to sing in soft, lilting tones. Tutors might recite Persian verses of Rumi or Hafez, and she would memorize them, ready to quote lines in moments of intimacy. Poetry was more than entertainment. It was a shared language of love, faith, and longing that could connect her with the Sultan on a deeper level. Imagine her voice, quiet in the lamplight, reciting lines about fleeting beauty or eternal devotion, while Murdad listened after long councils of war. But her education did not stop at performance. She learned domestic arts too, embroidery, weaving, and the preparation of perfumes. Her fingers stitched silks with golden thread, creating handkerchiefs or garments that she could present as gifts to the Sultan. These tokens carried more weight than jewels. They showed devotion expressed through labor and artistry. When she crushed roses into oil, or mixed musk with amber to make incense, she wasn't just learning a craft, she was creating atmosphere, building the sensory world of the palace where scent and texture shaped memory. Bathing rituals were another form of training. The harem's baths were not simply for hygiene, but for social interaction and refinement. The first concubine was guided through the rituals of cleansing, scrubbing, perfuming, and dressing afterward. These moments taught her the art of presentation, hair gleaming with oil, skin softened with herbs, robes scented with jasmine. Every detail was a performance, every appearance a reminder that she was sculpted into something beyond ordinary. Behind all this instruction, however, lay the constant pressure of scrutiny. The first concubine was always being watched. Eunuchs monitored her movements, attendants whispered about her progress, and older women judged whether she absorbed her lessons well. The harem thrived on gossip as much as on perfume. If she excelled, whispers lifted her reputation higher. If she stumbled, murmurs spread doubt about her worth. Every day was a test, and she lived with the knowledge that one mistake could unravel her fragile security. Her relationship with the Sultan was shaped by this training. When she entered his chamber, she was expected to embody everything she had been taught: soft-spoken, graceful, intelligent, pious. Her conversations could not be shallow. They had to display wit, learning, and humility. Her silences, too, had to be meaningful, filled with deference. It was a balancing act to be charming without arrogance, attentive without seeming desperate, learned without overshadowing. The harem drilled this balance into her until it became second nature. You could imagine her walking down a corridor one evening, lantern light flickering across her embroidered robe. She pauses to adjust her veil, ensuring it drapes just so. In her hand, she carries a lute, her fingers already rehearsing a melody. Behind her, eunuchs pace silently, their presence both reassuring and suffocating. As she enters the Sultan's chamber, she bows with practiced grace, begins to play, and fills the room with music that seems effortless, but has been honed through countless hours of instruction. The palace life extended beyond training and performance, of course. The first concubine had daily rhythms. Mornings began with ablution and prayer. Meals were taken on low tables: rice, lamb, olives, dates, sherbet sweetened with honey. Afternoons were filled with embroidery, reading, or music practice. Baths punctuated the week, evenings often devoted to waiting for the Sultan. Servants attended her constantly, though their service was never neutral. Every servant carried stories and gossip from other corners of the harem. Trust was rare, suspicion constant, but isolation was the price of privilege. The first concubine could not stroll in Bursa's markets, could not hear the street musicians, could not chat with neighbors in a courtyard. Her world shrank to the palace walls, filled with silks, marble, and whispers. Sometimes she might sit by a latticed window, gazing at the city below, her heart heavy with longing for freedom. Yet at the same time, she held a power few outside could imagine. Her voice, whispered to the Sultan in the quiet of night, could change decisions that shaped armies and borders. The Ottomans designed this life deliberately. By secluding women, they protected dynastic bloodlines from outside interference. By training them in refinement, they ensured the Sultan's private life mirrored his public grandeur, and by creating hierarchies within the harem, they kept competition alive, preventing any single woman from dominating unchecked. The first concubine was the beginning of this design, the prototype. Her training and palace life were not only personal experiences, but institutional experiments. As you picture her world now, imagine the layers of sound, the murmur of tutors drilling her in Turkish phrases, the pluck of lutes in the evening, the splash of water in marble baths, the soft rustle of silks in corridors. Add the scents: rose oil, musk, sandalwood, bread baking in distant kitchens. Add the sights: oil lamps casting halos, eunuchs standing rigid in shadows, the Sultan's gaze weighing her every gesture. This was the fabric of her existence, woven from beauty, control, and unrelenting vigilance. And within this fabric, she walked carefully, always aware that she was the first, the one who set the precedent. Her training was not just for her survival, but for the survival of the system itself. The Ottoman Harem, still in its infancy, was being shaped through her every step, her every gesture, her every carefully measured word. By now, you've watched her pass through selection, training, and the careful choreography of palace life. But the first concubine's story only sharpens when we turn to the question of hierarchy and authority, because the harem, even in its early and modest beginnings at Bursa, was never simply a cluster of women waiting idly behind curtains. It was an organized system structured like the empire itself, with rules, ranks, and rivalries. And with the arrival of the first concubine, this structure began to crystallize. Think of the Ottoman dynasty in the mid-14th century. The Sultan was consolidating power, stretching borders into the Balkans, and tightening control over Anatolia. He needed order not only on the battlefield but also in his household. The harem was, in its way, another army, disciplined, ranked, and controlled. The first concubine's presence demanded that ranks be defined. Without her, the harem was just a loose household of attendants and servants. With her, it became an institution. At the very top of this hierarchy stood the Sultan himself, of course, the axis around which the harem revolved. Below him was the concubine he favoured, in this case the very first. She had no official title like the later Haseki Sultan or Valide Sultan. Those designations would evolve in later centuries, but in practice she functioned as the model for what such authority would look like. Her word mattered, servants bowed lower, eunuchs listened more carefully. Even if her influence wasn't yet formalized, it was felt. Beneath her, a ladder of roles emerged. There were the Kalfa, senior women who supervised the younger ones. There were the Oda girls, often new arrivals, trained in service, music and etiquette. There were seamstresses, cooks and bath attendants, all female, each with her own task but also her own rank. The harem's hierarchy mirrored the army outside the walls. Discipline and obedience reinforced order, and those who obeyed rose in status. The eunuchs too played into this hierarchy. The chief eunuch, though not yet as powerful as he would become in later centuries, already acted as the gatekeeper. No one saw the Sultan without his knowledge. If the first concubine needed something, finer fabric, extra musicians, the word passed to the Sultan when he was busy with court. She had to work through the eunuchs, thus her authority was balanced by theirs, and survival required cultivating relationships with these silent watchers. Hierarchy extended into daily life. Who ate first? Who bathed at which hour? Who was allowed to sit closer to the windows? Every detail was mapped onto rank. The first concubine, naturally, received privileges others could only envy. She dined on richer dishes, her cushions placed higher than the rest. She bathed earlier, when the water was still fresh and warm. She was granted robes embroidered with real gold thread, while others wore plain silks. These distinctions weren't just luxuries, they were signals, constant reminders of her elevated status. But hierarchy was also fragile. A single slip could cost her everything. If the Sultan's favour shifted to another woman, the ladder rearranged itself, and so the first concubine had to defend her place, not only through obedience, but through mastery of the subtle politics of the harem. That meant knowing when to show deference, when to assert herself, and when to let silence speak louder than words. You can imagine her now, seated on a low divan, younger women standing around her with downcast eyes. A servant pours pomegranate sherbet into a cup, hands trembling slightly because serving her incorrectly could bring punishment. Another woman plays the lute softly in the background, her melody intended not for herself, but for the concubine's comfort. In that room, without raising her voice, the first concubine radiates authority. She does not need to declare herself. The hierarchy does it for her. This hierarchy also set the foundation for future power roles. Later centuries would see the rise of the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, as one of the most powerful figures in the empire. That tradition began here, with the recognition that the sultan's chosen woman was not just a companion, but an authority. Even without the title, the first concubine laid the groundwork. Her authority over servants, over training, over rituals of daily life would evolve into institutionalized power for her successors. Authority wasn't confined to the palace walls. Courtiers and viziers knew that whispers from the harem could reach the sultan's ears more quickly than petitions in the council chamber. The first concubine's words spoken at the right moment could shift his mood, alter a decision, or soften his stance. Even if she never sat in a council, her presence was felt in the outcomes of those councils. This soft power, invisible yet real, became one of the harem's greatest weapons. Still, her authority had limits. The Islamic framework of the empire demanded modesty, restraint, and seclusion. The first concubine could not stride into public halls or appear unveiled before men. Her influence had to remain veiled too, expressed indirectly. She learned to wield power not through direct orders, but through suggestion, through timing, through the art of being indispensable. The hierarchy both confined and empowered her, a paradox she had to navigate daily. Life inside this hierarchy was not without tension. Attendants envied her, whispered about her behind her back, plotted quietly to rise if her favor slipped. Eunuchs, loyal yet ambitious, sometimes tested how far they could bend her requests. Even tutors might align themselves with rivals, hoping to curry favor with whichever woman might replace her one day. Authority here was never absolute. It was contested, fragile, and in constant motion. But for now, she stood at the top. She was the standard by which all others measured themselves. The hierarchy of the harem reflected her presence, and its authority flowed through her. The system, still young, was being shaped in her image. Picture her one evening in the baths, steam rising around marble walls, attendants scrubbing her skin with coarse cloths before pouring water scented with jasmine. Other women sit nearby, waiting their turn, their eyes flicking toward her in envy. She says nothing, but her silence carries weight. In that silence lies the hierarchy of the harem, an unspoken language of who is first and who is not. Her authority also extended into ritual. On feast days, when the Sultan visited the harem to distribute gifts, she received hers first. On holy nights when prayers filled the palace, she led the women in recitation. When new girls arrived, she inspected them, sometimes even choosing who would be trained further and who would remain servants. In each of these roles, she was more than a concubine. She was an institution in herself. And yet, there must have been moments when she felt the weight of it pressing down. To be first meant to be watched constantly, envied relentlessly, and feared quietly. Authority could not be laid aside at will. It had to be performed every waking moment. A misstep would not only tarnish her, but could unravel the entire fragile system being built around her. So she carried it, the silks, the perfumes, the whispered authority, and the heavy burden of being the model for all who would follow. And in doing so, she defined what hierarchy and authority meant inside the Ottoman harem. The lamps burn lower now, their light glowing like half-drowsy eyes across the palace walls, and you follow her into the rhythm of daily routines. Because hierarchy and training gave the first concubine her place, but the true weight of her life lay in the day-to-day, in the meals, the prayers, the entertainments, and the long, watchful silences that filled the hours. The harem, for all its mystique, was not an endless carnival of jewels and laughter. It was structured, repetitive, and measured like the gears of a clock, and within those ticking rhythms the first concubine learned how to survive. Her mornings began with the call to prayer. The muezzim's voice floated across Bursa's rooftops, curling through the latticed windows of the palace like smoke. She would rise from her bed, the silken sheets heavy against her skin, and make her way to the basin where water waited. Ablution was never just about cleansing. It was about preparing her body and spirit to face the day under watchful eyes. Servants poured water from bronze ewers, their hands steady, their faces lowered. She washed her hands, her mouth, her face, her arms, her feet. A ritual that reminded her she was not only the Sultan's companion, but also a servant of God. After prayer came breakfast. The trays arrived carried by eunuchs, laden with bread still warm from the ovens. Bowls of olives slick with oil, honey glistening like amber, dates sweet enough to stick to her fingers. She ate sitting cross-legged on cushions embroidered with tulips, a cup of sweetened sherbet or goat's milk at her side. These meals, simple by the standards of later Ottoman excess, were still richer than anything she might have known before entering the palace. Yet she ate slowly, carefully. Every movement was observed. Even the way she lifted bread to her lips was supposed to reflect refinement. The mid-morning hours were for instruction and refinement. Tutors came with instruments, books, or embroidery frames. One day she might practice Turkish proverbs, repeating them until they slid from her tongue with no hint of foreignness. Another day she might learn the rhythms of a Persian ghazal, reciting poetry that carried the perfume of far-off gardens. Music filled her chamber often. The plucked notes of a tambour, the soft hum of a ney flute, the clap of small hand drums marking rhythm. If she missed a note or fumbled a line, she would feel her attendants' eyes flick toward one another, the smallest hint of gossip ready to sprout. By midday, the palace settled into stillness. The summer sun pressed down on the city outside, but inside the harem, marble walls kept the air cool. She would retreat to the baths, where steam wrapped her body in warmth, and attendants scrubbed her skin with rough cloths until it glowed pink. Then they poured rose water across her shoulders, perfumed oil across her hair, combing it into gleaming waves. These baths were not only about cleanliness, they were rehearsals in beauty, a way of ensuring she appeared each evening like a vision sculpted from fragrance and light. Afternoons were quieter. She might sit by a lattice window, embroidery in her lap, golden thread gleaming between her fingers. From outside drifted the shouts of merchants, the braying of donkeys, the clang of blacksmiths hammering steel. Those sounds reminded her of the world beyond, a world she could no longer touch. Sometimes she felt envy toward the women in the market, free to haggle, to laugh openly, to walk in the sun. Yet she also knew those women envied her. They looked up at the palace windows and whispered about her silks, her privileges, her closeness to the Sultan. The daily routine of the first concubine was shaped by that paradox: imprisoned, yet envied. When the sun slid lower, the palace stirred again. Evening was the time of music, conversation, and waiting. She would dress in fresh silks, her attendants layering fabric dyed in deep crimson or emerald, fastening a sash embroidered with silver thread. Jewels sparkled at her wrists, though never in excess. The early harem was still modest compared to later centuries of extravagance. A light veil softened her face, enough to blur but not conceal her features. Dinner arrived on low trays: roasted lamb with cumin, rice flecked with saffron, chickpeas stewed in garlic and oil, fruits piled high. She ate with her attendants, though her portion was always served first, her dishes more carefully prepared. Conversation was quiet. A murmur of voices never too loud, for the walls had ears. Gossip travelled like wildfire in the harem, and a poorly chosen remark could return to her in whispers sharpened into knives. After dinner came the hours of waiting for the Sultan. Some nights he arrived, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, the eunuchs bowing low as he passed. She would rise, bow, and greet him with the grace she had practiced endlessly. Music played, sherbet was poured, soft conversation drifted between them. These evenings could end in laughter, poetry, or silence broken only by the rustle of fabric as he reached for her hand. Other nights he did not come at all, and she sat in her chamber, the lute silent at her side, wondering if his absence meant displeasure. The rhythm of waiting was as much a part of her life as the meals or prayers. Waiting taught her patience, discipline, and the art of filling silence with dignity. She learned never to ask why he did not come, never to show resentment. Her worth depended on her ability to remain composed, to embody grace even in disappointment. And woven into these routines were festivals and holy days. On Fridays, when the Sultan attended prayers at the mosque, she might prepare a gift for him: a handkerchief she embroidered with tulips, a small vial of perfume she mixed herself. On holy nights, when the palace echoed with Quranic recitation, she joined the other women in prayer, her voice rising softly with theirs, the sound like a river flowing beneath stone. These moments reminded her that her role was not only personal but spiritual. She was expected to embody not just beauty but piety, to be a vessel of both refinement and faith. Still, within the rhythms of prayer, meals, and music, there was monotony. The palace walls did not change. The corridors echoed with the same steps. The baths steamed with the same scents. The daily routine, while structured, could feel suffocating, and in those quiet hours, she had to find ways to keep her mind alive. Sometimes she whispered old songs from her childhood, careful that no one overheard. Sometimes she pressed her forehead to the cool stone and imagined herself walking freely through the city below. Her body was confined, but her mind travelled where it pleased. The eunuchs, ever present, also shaped her routines. They controlled who entered her chamber, who brought her food, who carried her words. Their presence was a reminder that her life, though privileged, was not her own, and yet some of them became her allies, passing small messages, ensuring she received finer fruits, perhaps even warning her of whispers spreading among rivals. She learned to navigate their moods, to offer a word of kindness here, a respectful gesture there, building subtle networks of loyalty within the rigid structure. Her days were also punctuated by instruction in crafts and knowledge. She learned to recognize the scent of different spices, to distinguish saffron from turmeric, cinnamon from clove. She studied patterns of embroidery not just as art, but as symbols: tulips for faith, cypresses for eternity, roses for divine love. These symbols decorated not only fabrics, but also her own self-presentation. A handkerchief embroidered with tulips, placed subtly where the Sultan could see it, whispered loyalty without a word. Imagine her now, sitting cross-legged as evening falls, her fingers tracing the final stitch of a delicate rose pattern. Outside, the city drums beat faintly in celebration of a military victory. Inside, she hears the eunuch's footsteps approach, signaling the Sultan's arrival. She sets her embroidery aside, straightens her robe, and breathes deeply. Her daily routine has prepared her for this moment, to shift seamlessly from silence to performance, from waiting to presence. These routines, repeated endlessly, did more than fill her days. They built the foundation of the Ottoman Harem as an institution. The harem was not sustained by passion alone, it was sustained by order, discipline, and ritual. The first concubine's routines became the model. Later generations of women would follow similar patterns. The prayers, the baths, the music, the waiting, all echoing her footsteps. And yet, within that repetition, she carved a life. Her laughter in quiet moments, her whispered prayers, her longing glances through the lattice. These small human details kept her from becoming merely a symbol. She was not just the first concubine of the Ottoman harem, she was a woman living day by day, her life measured not only in titles and influence but in the quiet cadence of meals, prayers, baths, and waiting. The palace at Bursa breathes differently when dusk settles. Drums beat faintly from the barracks, the call to evening prayer lingers like incense in the air, and the corridors of the harem grow expectant. Because now we reach the question that defined so much of the first concubine's existence. The Sultan's favor. Without it, her position is fragile, her silks nothing more than costumes. With it, she becomes more than a companion. She becomes the axis of the dynasty's intimate and political life. To understand her world, you must imagine the balance she lived under every night. Murad I, like his predecessors and successors, was not a man free from pressure. He was ruler of a young empire fighting wars on multiple fronts, leading armies into the Balkans, presiding over councils of viziers, and ensuring his dynasty's legitimacy. By the time he entered his private chambers, he carried the weight of conquest and governance on his shoulders. The first concubine's task was to lighten that weight, to transform his private world into a place of refuge, desire, and influence. But winning and keeping his favor was never as simple as beauty. Beauty opened the door, yes, but it was wit, composure, and adaptability that kept her inside. The Sultan could find beauty in 100 women brought as captives or gifts. What he needed was someone who could hold his attention in silence as much as in song, someone who could sense when to speak and when to listen, when to laugh softly at his jokes, and when to fold her hands in solemn agreement. The first concubine learned quickly that favor was a game of subtlety. You can picture her seated on a cushion beside him, the flicker of an oil lamp casting their shadows across the walls. He returns from a campaign council, weary and irritable, maps still fresh in his mind. She offers him sherbet cooled with snow, brought from Aludar, its sweetness laced with rosewater. She does not ask about the council. Not yet. She watches the way his shoulders ease as he drinks, the way his voice softens when he speaks of trivial things, a falcon that flew poorly that morning, a guard who tripped and made the viziers laugh. She lets him speak of these small matters until the edge of his mood dull. Only then does she tilt her head, her eyes lowered, and ask something that matters. That is the art of favor, timing. To please the Sultan is not to smother him with affection, but to give him space when needed, to offer a word when silence grows heavy, to remind him of power without making him feel controlled. The first concubine mastered this art because her survival depended on it. Favor also meant privileges. When the Sultan favored her, she received richer robes, finer jewels, and more attendants. Her meals grew more elaborate, lamb slow-cooked with apricots, rice jeweled with pomegranate seeds. Gifts arrived from distant provinces, silks from Bursa's looms, spices from the Levant, honey from Anatolian villages. Each gift was a sign not only of the Sultan's affection, but of her rising status in the palace hierarchy. The other women saw these signs and understood them for what they were, The Sultan's attention made her untouchable, but the risks of favor were just as sharp. To be favored meant to be envied. Attendants whispered behind doors, rivals plotted quietly, eunuchs measured every shift in her position. A single word of displeasure from the Sultan could unravel everything. The harem's memory was long, and stories of women who had fallen from favor lingered like ghostly warnings. Some were quietly sent away, married off to loyal officials. Others lived the rest of their days in obscurity, their jewels stripped, their chambers reassigned. The first concubine knew that favor, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. So she cultivated it carefully. She learned his moods, how his eyes hardened after battle, how his shoulders softened after prayer, how his laughter came more easily when music filled the room. She used her training, the poetry, the songs, the perfumes, like weapons, each deployed at the right time. A line from Rumi, whispered at night, could soothe his restlessness. A gentle melody played on the oud could quiet his thoughts. Even silence, held gracefully, could please him more than clumsy chatter. This favor carried political weight as well. When Murad listened to her in private, her words sometimes slipped into decisions that shaped the empire. A soft suggestion about a vizier's arrogance, a comment about a governor's mismanagement, even an observation about a servant's loyalty. These could ripple outward into real consequences. Though she never sat in council, her presence in his chambers was a quiet form of counsel. This was the unseen power of the harem. Influence carried on whispers rather than decrees. Her rivals, of course, saw this too. They studied her, tried to imitate her gestures, her way of speaking. Some tried to undermine her by spreading rumors, perhaps claiming she mocked the Sultan behind his back, or that she whispered with eunuchs too freely. The harem thrived on suspicion, and envy made its corridors dangerous. The first concubine survived not only by winning favor but by defending it, countering gossip with dignity, ensuring her every movement was above reproach. One evening, picture her seated in her chamber, the Sultan beside her. While attendants play a soft tune, she pours sherbet into his cup, her movements practiced, her face serene. He takes the cup, sips, and smiles faintly. Outside the chamber, eunuchs exchange glances, noting his softened mood. Tomorrow, courtiers will whisper that the Sultan seemed lighter, more decisive, and they will know it was her doing. Her favor does not remain hidden behind veils. It radiates outward, shaping how the empire sees its ruler. Yet, for all this power, she remained aware of its fragility. She could not forget that she was, at her core, still a concubine. She had been chosen, elevated, wrapped in silks, but she was not irreplaceable. A new woman could arrive tomorrow, younger, more beautiful, more clever, and shift the Sultan's gaze. The first concubine lived always with that shadow at her shoulder, and it made her cautious. She never grew careless, never assumed her place was eternal. She lived each day as if she had to win favor anew. This tension infused her life with both fear and exhilaration. To be favored was to walk a tightrope above whispers, gifts, and dangers. One misstep meant the rope snapped. But while she balanced, she saw her life was richer, her influence wider, her name whispered across Bursa's markets as the Sultan's chosen companion. And in that favor, she also glimpsed something human. Beneath the Sultan's title, beneath the weight of conquest and politics, he was still a man, weary, restless, longing at times for comfort, as much as for counsel. She gave him that, and in return, he gave her favor. It was an exchange as old as power itself, yet in the Ottoman Harem it became the very foundation of dynastic survival. So when you picture her tonight, imagine her seated at his side, the glow of an oil lamp softening their shadows, her voice low as she recites a verse of poetry. He listens, his eyes half closed, the burdens of empire slipping from his shoulders for a moment. That moment, fleeting yet real, is the essence of favor. It is why she endured, why she held her place, and why the first concubine of the Ottoman Harem became not only a companion but a force within the empire. By now you know her power lay not just in silks, perfumes, and nightly routines, but in something subtler. The way her closeness to the Sultan could ripple outward into politics, The Ottomans were an empire of war and law, but they were also an empire of whispers, and few whispers mattered more than those spoken beside the Sultan's ear in the quiet hours. The first concubine's presence was never limited to the private chamber. She became a political influence, not through official titles or councils, but through the delicate web of intimacy, timing, and trust. Murad I, the ruler at this time, faced enormous challenges. His armies fought the Serbs, Bulgarians, and Hungarians. His statesmen sought to balance expansion with administration. His judges, the Qadis, tried to uphold Islamic law in newly conquered lands filled with Christians and non-Muslims. Every decision carried weight, and though he sat in grand councils with viziers, it was in the quiet of the harem that his mind could be swayed. The first concubine knew this. Her political influence did not need parchment, seals, or public decrees. It needed only the right words spoken at the right time, when no one else was listening. Imagine him returning from council late at night, his robes smelling faintly of sweat, dust and horse leather after a long ride from a military review. He sits heavily on cushions, and she pours sherbet into a cup, her movements unhurried, her gaze lowered. He drinks, sighs, mutters about the arrogance of a vizier who questioned his plans. She listens, not interrupting, not advising yet, just letting the silence draw him into confession. When the moment is right, she tilts her head and murmurs something as simple as, "Pride clouds wisdom, my lord." He nods. He may not even realize her words echo later in council, when he rebukes the vizier for arrogance. Her voice becomes his thought, her whisper his judgment. This was the invisible politics of the harem. It wasn't official. It wasn't recorded in chronicles, but it was real. The men of the empire often pretended women held no political power, yet many quietly feared it. To share a bed with the Sultan was to share the empire's ear. The first concubine's influence may not have been written in law, but it was inscribed in decisions, alliances, and policies shaped by her presence. One of the clearest areas of her political weight was succession. The Ottoman dynasty's survival depended on heirs. Every concubine was brought in not just for beauty or companionship, but for the possibility of bearing sons. The first concubine knew that if she gave Murad a son, her status would rise beyond measure. She would not just be the Sultan's companion, she would be the mother of a prince, a potential ruler of the empire. This alone gave her voice a sharper edge in political matters. Viziers and governors might tread carefully, knowing her womb carried the future. Even before bearing a child, though, her influence in succession questions was significant. She could, for instance, soften the Sultan toward one of his other sons, or sharpen his suspicion against a rival. She could praise one boy's character, intelligence, or bravery, planting seeds in the Sultan's mind. Over time, these small suggestions shaped which princes were favored, which were overlooked. In an empire where fratricide, brothers killing brothers, would become a grim tradition, the stakes of her whispers were enormous. A single word in the harem could tilt the scales of survival for a prince, and by extension for entire provinces that would one day follow him. Her influence extended to court disputes as well. Governors and viziers often sought indirect ways to reach the Sultan's private ear. Of course, they could not speak to the first concubine directly. The harem's walls were tightly guarded, but they could bribe eunuchs, plant gifts, or send coded messages through servants. These subtle channels often ended up in her chamber. A fine bolt of silk for the lady's embroidery might carry the silent hope of political favor. A rare spice for her perfume might conceal a request for mercy toward a governor. She learned to read these gestures. Sometimes she dismissed them with a laugh, sometimes she let them color her words when the Sultan seemed undecided. The eunuchs, ever vigilant, played a role in these exchanges. They filtered gifts, decided what messages could pass, and often twisted the stream to their own advantage. The first concubine understood she had to manage them as carefully as she managed the Sultan. A eunuch loyal to her could ensure she received the finest gifts, the most flattering reports. One who turned against her could starve her of information, letting rivals shine brighter. Thus her political influence was not only vertical toward the Sultan, but horizontal, spread across the delicate networks inside the harem itself. Consider how this influence might ripple into external policy. A rival emir in Anatolia angers the sultan. Punishment is planned. That evening, in the harem, the first concubine reminds him softly of the emir's daughter, taken captive years before, who now serves quietly among the harem women. "She prays with us, my lord," she says, her tone gentle, her eyes downcast. The sultan hesitates. Harsh punishment might endanger the girl. Perhaps leniency is better. The next day, the emir receives a lighter sentence. He never knows why his fate shifted, but the reason is simple. A concubine's whisper. Her influence also extended into matters of diplomacy. Foreign envoys, though barred from direct contact with the harem, often spoke of it with awe and suspicion. They knew that gifts sent to the harem could grease the wheels of negotiation. Venetian and Genoese merchants, active in Bursa, sometimes hinted that a rare jewel or exotic fabric might find its way to the sultan's favoured woman. These gifts, if accepted, became silent tokens of goodwill. The first concubine, by wearing a Venetian brooch or praising Italian silk, could signal to the sultan that these foreigners were worth indulging. Diplomacy flowed through fabric and perfume as much as through treaties. And yet, her influence was not unchecked. She walked a thin line. If she pushed too boldly, the sultan might resent her meddling. If she remained too passive, her rivals could eclipse her. Her political power depended on balance, offering counsel disguised as devotion, shaping thoughts without appearing to lead them. The first concubine learned to frame her influence in the language of loyalty and faith. Rather than saying, "Do this," she would murmur, "God favours justice, my lord," or "Your wisdom brings peace." Her advice became indistinguishable from flattery, and that made it irresistible. Her presence also reshaped the harem itself into a political microcosm. Women who served her basked in reflected power. Attendants loyal to her gained privileges, better food, richer fabrics. Those who opposed her found themselves demoted to lesser duties, scrubbing floors or serving meals. Authority inside the harem mirrored politics outside it. Factions rose and fell around her like miniature governments. To support the first concubine was to join the winning side. To oppose her was to risk being crushed in silence. Still, danger lingered. Favor was fragile, envy sharp. Rivals might accuse her of arrogance, of manipulating the sultan, of being too close to foreign merchants. A eunuch might spread whispers that she plotted against other concubines. One slip, one careless word, could become poison. The harem, for all its silks and perfumes, was a battlefield no less treacherous than Kosovo or Varna. The first concubine fought her battles not with steel, but with smiles, silences, and carefully placed whispers. And you must remember, this was only the beginning. Later centuries would see harem women like Hurrem Sultan, Roxilana, openly dictate policy, write letters to foreign monarchs, and shape succession with iron hands. But their path was paved here, in the modest chambers of Bursa, where the first concubine discovered that intimacy was power, and that power could ripple outward into the fate of nations. So when you think of her tonight, don't picture only silks, perfumes and veils. Picture the invisible threads she wove, threads that stretched from her chamber to the council hall, from her whispered words to the battlefield. Picture her as both companion and counselor, as the quiet force that bent the sultan's will in subtle arcs. For in the Ottoman Empire, politics did not live only in maps and swords. It lived also in the soft voice of a concubine at night. The harem, though hidden behind guarded walls, was never quiet for long. Whispers slid through corridors faster than footsteps, and envy grew like ivy in the cracks of marble. The first concubine, once securely seated at the sultan's side, soon discovered that the greatest test of her survival was not only keeping Murad's favour, but fending off the women who came after her. Because no matter how cherished she was, the sultan's needs, politics and sheer human restlessness meant new concubines would always arrive. And with each new arrival came rivalry, tension and the gnawing fear of being replaced. At first, the palace's hierarchy worked in her favour. As the earliest and most favoured woman, she was deferred to by attendants, obeyed by eunuchs, and imitated by newcomers. Her authority was visible in the way she bathed first in the hammam, ate from the richest trays, and received the sultan's gifts before others. But privilege was a double-edged sword. To sit at the top was to paint a target on one's back. Every newcomer measured herself against her, and every woman who failed to rise whispered her frustrations in dark corners. The rivals arrived from many directions. Some were captives taken in raids. Slavic girls with pale hair and sharp features, prized for their exoticness. Others came as gifts from provincial governors, eager to please the Sultan, their beauty polished by weeks of preparation before presentation. Still others were purchased in the slave markets of Bursa, carefully chosen for their youth, grace, or rare talents. Each new arrival was trained, perfumed, and dressed, then set loose in the gilded cage of the harem, and every one of them knew the story. The first concubine held the Sultan's gaze. To dislodge her would mean instant elevation. The first concubine learned quickly that rivalry did not always announce itself openly. It lived in glances, in laughter that carried a hidden barb, in the way servants subtly shifted their loyalties. A young newcomer might accidentally let slip a rumor that the first concubine was too old, too proud, too accustomed to privilege. An attendant might forget to deliver a gift meant for her, quietly redirecting it to another chamber. A eunuch, bribed by a rival, might whisper that the Sultan looked weary of her presence. These were the weapons of the harem, not swords and arrows, but gossip, omission, and quiet sabotage. She responded with equal subtlety. Rather than lashing out, she doubled down on composure. She knew that to show anger was to reveal weakness. So she smiled when rivals laughed, nodded when they whispered, and carried herself with unshakable dignity. The more they tried to rattle her, the calmer she appeared. This calmness became her armor, her way of reminding everyone that she was untouchable. Even the eunuchs, wary of siding with anyone too volatile, leaned toward her because she seemed unshaken. Still, there were moments when the tension broke through. Imagine one evening in the baths, steam curling up from marble basins, women gathered in groups, their laughter echoing in the chamber. A newcomer, bold from youth, makes a sly remark about how quickly the Sultan's gaze shifts. The air goes still. Attendants glance between them. The first concubine smiles faintly, dips a cloth into rose-scented water, and says, "Then you will see how long a single gaze can last." The women laugh nervously, but the point is made. The bath, meant for relaxation, has become an arena, and she has reminded them who rules it. Her rivals were not only women. Eunuchs, too, could turn into enemies or allies depending on how they were treated. A eunuch who felt slighted might favor another concubine, giving her more chances to be noticed by the Sultan. The first concubine learned to cultivate them carefully, offering respect, ensuring they received small tokens, never treating them as mere servants. By building networks of loyalty, she countered the whispers of her rivals. The greatest danger of rivalry, however, was not humiliation, but replacement. The harem was designed to prevent any one woman from monopolizing the Sultan. Tradition allowed each concubine to bear only one son, after which she would be removed from his bed and given her own quarters. This ensured succession remained spread among multiple mothers, preventing any single woman from dominating. The first concubine knew this rule loomed over her. Even if she pleased the Sultan endlessly, once she bore a son, her role would shift, and rivals waited eagerly for that shift, ready to pounce on the new space beside the throne. The tension grew sharper as the harem expanded. The more women entered, the more factions formed. Some grouped themselves by origin, Balkan girls banding together, Circassians whispering among themselves, Turkish women claiming seniority, others aligned by personality. The ambitious clustering around bold leaders, the timid attaching themselves to whoever seemed safest. The first concubine had to navigate all these factions, ensuring none grew strong enough to topple her. She did so by never isolating herself. She gave small gestures of kindness to some, tokens of respect to others, ensuring no single faction could unite against her. Yet despite her caution, she could never erase the constant hum of envy. Rivals watched every change in her robes, every gift she received, every glance from the Sultan. If his gaze lingered on another woman during a feast, whispers spread instantly. Her time is ending. If he laughed too long at another's song, the harem vibrated with speculation. The first concubine lived inside this storm daily, learning to project serenity even when her stomach knotted with fear. But rivalry was not purely destructive. In some ways, it kept her sharp. Knowing others waited to take her place forced her to refine her skills, to sing better, to speak more wisely, to perfume herself with rarer scents, to master silence more artfully. The competition turned the harem into a crucible, and she emerged stronger for it. Her rivals, by sharpening their claws, sharpened hers too. Of course, sometimes rivalry turned darker. There were rumors of poisoned sherbet, of oils laced with powders that burned skin, of fabric dusted with irritants that caused rashes. The harem was not always gentle. The first concubine had to be careful with what she ate, what she wore, even what she touched. Servants tasted her food before she did, and she often watched their faces closely to ensure nothing was amiss. Her survival depended on vigilance as much as on grace. In the end, rivalry defined her as much as favor. To be the first concubine was to live in constant tension, loved by the sultan, envied by women, scrutinized by eunuchs. Every day brought new threats, wrapped in silks, new dangers hidden behind smiles. And yet, she endured. By enduring, she carved out the template that others would later follow. Picture her tonight, seated in her chamber, embroidery in her lap, the faint laughter of rivals drifting down the corridor. She hears it, but she does not flinch. She threads her needle calmly, each stitch a reminder that she will not be shaken. She knows the rivalry will never end. It is built into the very walls of the harem, but she also knows that her composure, her ability to stand unbroken in the storm, is what makes her the first, and what ensures her legacy outlasts her rivals' whispers. The first concubine's life balanced constantly on fragile threads, but none of those threads carried more weight than the question of motherhood. In the Ottoman dynasty, a woman's status was never secure by beauty alone. Silks, jewels, and even the sultan's favor could fade overnight, but to bear a son, to give the dynasty an heir, was to transform one's place entirely. This was where rivalry sharpened into something deadly serious, because the womb was not just a vessel of love or lineage, it was a battlefield where the future of the empire was fought. From the earliest days she knew this truth. Tutors, eunuchs, even whispering attendants reminded her that her greatest duty was not to sing, embroider, or perfume the palace air. It was to carry a child for the sultan. To be the mother of a prince meant survival, power, and in time, near royal authority. To remain barren meant fragility, the risk of fading into obscurity once her youth dimmed, or the sultan's gaze wandered. When whispers spread through the harem that the first concubine was pregnant, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Imagine the scene. Eunuchs hurrying down corridors with unreadable expressions, attendants pressing their ears to walls for gossip, rival women calculating what this meant for their own chances. For the empire, the news meant stability. For the harem, it meant war. Pregnancy in the harem was never private. Every symptom, a missed cycle, a sudden fatigue, a refusal of food, was noted, whispered, and carried to the sultan by watchful servants. Once confirmed, the mother-to-be received special treatment. Her meals were enriched with almonds, figs, and honey. Physicians hovered with remedies, talismans, and prayers. The first concubine's chamber, filled with fabrics embroidered with protective verses, amulets hung on her walls to shield her from envy and the evil eye. But with protection came surveillance. Every rival in the harem watched her more closely, hoping for signs of weakness. If she miscarried, her enemies would not mourn. They would whisper, "She is not chosen after all." Carrying a son meant something greater still. Ottoman tradition allowed concubines only one son each. After giving birth, they were withdrawn from the sultan's bed, both to preserve fairness and to prevent one woman from amassing too much dynastic power. This custom, sometimes called the one mother, one son rule, meant the first concubine's role would change forever once she became a mother. She would lose the intimacy of being Murad's nightly companion, but she would gain something more enduring, the role of valet to a prince, and potentially, if her son outlived his brothers, valet sultan, mother of the ruler. Picture her as her belly grows, the weight pressing against her silk robes, her steps slower but more purposeful. Attendants fan her, bring her sherbet cooled with snow, press cushions behind her back when she sits. Eunuchs guard her chamber more fiercely than ever, for now she carries the empire's future within her, and in the quiet of night, when the palace has stilled, she places her hand on her stomach and whispers prayers. Prayers for survival, for strength, for the child within to be a son. Childbirth in the 14th century was perilous, and even inside the palace, with midwives and physicians on hand, death lingered at the edges of the birthing chamber. When her time came, lamps burned through the night. Women crowded around her, midwives giving orders, attendants praying, rivals waiting outside with mixed hope and dread. The cries of labor echoed through stone corridors, carrying not just the sound of pain, but the weight of dynastic hope. If she lived and the child lived, the harem's order would shift forever. If she or the child died, the hierarchy would reset, and another woman would seize her place. When the infant's cry finally pierced the night, the palace erupted in sound. Shouts of Allahu Akbar, the tramp of eunuchs rushing to announce the news, the murmur of prayers of thanksgiving. A boy, if it was a boy, meant the dynasty's survival was assured. The first concubine, sweating and trembling, her body exhausted, was now transformed into something far greater, the mother of a prince. The birth of a son altered her status in profound ways. She would no longer share the sultan's bed. True, but she would now preside over her own small court within the harem. Her son became her anchor, her shield, and her weapon. She poured her energy into raising him, teaching him prayers, stories, and manners, always with one eye on the future. She knew that one day, this boy might fight his brothers for the throne, and her influence in shaping him could mean life or death. Not only for him, but for herself. But what if the child was a daughter? The harem's whispers would shift instantly. A daughter was valuable for alliances through marriage, but not for succession. A concubine who bore only daughters might still hold affection but rarely held enduring power. For the first concubine, bearing a daughter would have been bittersweet. She would still gain respect as a mother, but without a son, her place remained precarious, vulnerable to rivals who had yet to prove their fertility. The empire's harsh realities cast long shadows. Ottoman succession practices were brutal, and in later centuries they would become infamous for fratricide, brothers killing brothers to secure the throne. This meant the harem was not just a nursery, but a crucible of dynastic conflict. Mothers of princes formed factions, each seeking to elevate their son above the rest. And though this full system had yet to evolve in Murad's day, its seeds were already present. The first concubine's motherhood laid the foundation for this ruthless game, showing how bearing a son transformed the balance of power within the harem and beyond. Imagine her cradling her infant son, the candlelight flickering across his tiny face. To her, he is not only a child, but a destiny. She sings softly to him, not just lullabies, but prayers that he will survive childhood, outlast rivals, and someday ascend the throne. Her rivals, meanwhile, whisper outside, "If her boy lives, we are finished." The birth of one child could tilt the future of the empire. Motherhood also reshaped her relationship with the Sultan. Murad, though distanced from her bed after the birth, still visited her chamber to see his son. These visits kept her in his presence, and her composure in those moments mattered. She had to show gratitude without arrogance, devotion without desperation. Her words during those visits could still influence him, reminding him gently of his child's strength, urging him subtly to favor her son's tutors or protectors. In this way, even after intimacy ended, motherhood sustained her political influence. Yet the dangers of motherhood were immense. A sickly child could spell disaster, as rivals would whisper that God did not favor her. A son's death could plunge her back into vulnerability. Even survival carried risks. The boy might grow into a threat to his brothers, and her efforts to protect him could spark accusations of intrigue. The harem's history, beginning with her, was soaked not only in perfumes but in the bitter fear of losing children to illness, rivals, or politics. Still, she bore the burden with composure, because to be mother of a prince was to hold the empire in her arms, however briefly. The daily routines of baths, silks, and perfumes now revolved around her child. She oversaw his nurses, his toys, his first lessons. She guarded him not just as a mother, but as a strategist, aware that every detail of his upbringing could influence his fate. And as her son grew, so too did her stature. No longer merely the Sultan's first concubine, she became the prototype of something new, the prince's mother, the woman whose influence would stretch into the next generation. Later centuries would give this role a formal title, Valid Sultan, but in her time she embodied it without name, shaping a model others would follow. When you think of her now, picture her seated beside a cradle draped in embroidered fabric, her hand resting lightly on her son's chest as he sleeps. Outside, the palace drums beat faintly, signaling another victory in the Balkans. Inside, the empire's truest victory lies in this small chamber, in the tiny body breathing beneath her hand. For dynasties are not forged only in battles and treaties. They are forged in the cries of infants, in the milk of mothers, in the quiet prayers whispered at cradle sides. And so, the first concubine of the Ottoman Harem secured her place not only by pleasing the Sultan, but by doing what mattered most, giving him a son. In her motherhood lay the empire's future, and in her son's survival lay her own. By now the first concubine had carried the weight of beauty, favour, rivalry, and motherhood. But there was another layer pressing over her daily life, the way religion and morality framed her very existence. To understand her fully, you have to step into the mindset of the 14th century Ottomans, a world where the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet, and centuries of legal interpretation shaped not just battles and taxes, but also the invisible walls of the harem. Her place was not only defined by silks and politics, but by divine sanction, public perception, and the constant negotiation between faith and pragmatism. The word harem itself came from the Arabic haram, meaning sacred, forbidden, or inviolable. This was not just about locking women away, it was about creating a protected space, one that was as much religious as it was political. To outsiders, especially European travellers, the harem later became a symbol of decadence and sensuality. But for the Ottomans, in its early form, it was something different. A household organised under Islamic principles, a place where seclusion, modesty, and dynastic security converged. The first concubine lived at the centre of this paradox, simultaneously elevated and hidden, praised as a divine gift yet also labelled morally dangerous if she overstepped. Islamic law permitted concubinage under certain conditions. Enslaved women, captured in war or acquired through trade, could be taken as concubines. Children born of such unions were legitimate, bearing the father's name and inheritance. This made concubinage not a shameful secret, but a sanctioned path to building dynasties. For the Ottomans, it had clear advantages. Unlike marrying foreign princesses, who brought foreign loyalties and family interference, concubines had no outside ties. Their children belonged fully to the dynasty. The first concubine embodied this principle. She may have been of foreign origin, but once inside the harem, she was absorbed fully into the Ottoman household. Still, morality was never simple. Scholars debated endlessly over the fine points. Some jurists praised the practice as lawful, a safeguard for the dynasty. Others muttered that sultans should restrain themselves, that concubines should not replace lawful wives entirely. Within the palace, women themselves carried these tensions in their prayers. The first concubine likely performed her devotions daily, whispering verses of the Quran even as she prepared to share the sultan's bed. She lived in a space where piety and sensuality were expected to coexist, a difficult balance, one that demanded not only obedience but constant self-control. For the public, the morality of the harem was framed through a lens of legitimacy. Subjects rarely saw its inner workings, but they saw its outcomes: princes born, dynasties secured, succession made stable. As long as the harem produced heirs, the people accepted it as part of divine providence. Poets compared the sultan to Solomon, surrounded by women as a sign of divine favour. Preachers reminded congregations that kings of old had harems, and that Ottoman power too was protected by God's will. The first concubine, therefore, was not merely a private companion, she was a living proof of divine blessing upon the dynasty. Yet, morality also meant danger. If whispers spread that a concubine acted arrogantly, neglected her prayers, or overstepped into men's affairs too boldly, she risked being painted as corrupt. The first concubine had to embody not only refinement but also piety. She was expected to know her Quran, to fast during Ramadan, to give alms discreetly through eunuchs, and to present herself as a model of modesty even while living at the pinnacle of privilege. Her robes might glitter with gold, but her manner had to remain humble. In this, she reflected the paradox of the empire itself, rich and expanding, yet bound by law and faith. Inside the harem, religious rituals marked her days as much as perfumes and embroidery. Before dawn she washed and prayed, her voice rising softly with the others in the chamber. During Ramadan her fasts were observed strictly, even as trays of food for the evening iftar arrived piled with delicacies. On Fridays she prepared small gifts for charity, knowing eunuchs would distribute them in her name. These acts were not only religious duties but political signals. They showed the Sultan and the wider court that she embodied the morality expected of a mother of princes. The architecture of morality was visible too. The harem was not built simply as a prison for women, but as a sacred enclosure, echoing the seclusion of the Prophet's wives in Medina. Screens, latticed windows, and guarded corridors created both physical and symbolic separation. For the first concubine, these barriers were constant reminders of her dual role, inaccessible to the public eye, yet central to public legitimacy. She could never walk freely in the bazaar, but her veiled presence behind the palace's lattice spoke volumes. Her invisibility itself became a symbol of sanctity. Public perception of the harem oscillated between reverence and suspicion. On one hand, the people saw it as a symbol of divine blessing, the sultan surrounded by beauty and fertility, the dynasty assured of heirs. On the other, they feared the unseen influence of women, whispering that intrigues inside could twist the sultan's judgment. Satirical poems and folk tales sometimes portrayed harems as nests of scheming women. The first concubine had to navigate this reputation carefully, ensuring she never appeared as a manipulator. Her influence had to be cloaked in the language of devotion, her advice framed as reminders of justice and piety, never as ambition. Her rivals, of course, weaponized morality against her. If a concubine wished to undermine her, she might spread whispers that the first concubine neglected her prayers, that she showed vanity in her jewels, that she dared to give advice in tones too sharp for a woman. Such accusations, though whispered, could damage her standing more than open rivalry. For in an empire where legitimacy was rooted in divine will, to appear irreligious was to appear illegitimate. The first concubine knew this, and she guarded her piety as carefully as she guarded her silks. Consider her during Ramadan, seated before a tray at sunset, breaking her fast with dates and water. Around her, women murmur prayers, eunuchs bow respectfully, and the Sultan himself may arrive to share the evening meal. In that moment, her role is more than personal. She embodies the moral face of the harem, showing that even in seclusion, the dynasty remains tied to God. Her very presence reassures those who whisper outside the walls that the empire is not ruled by passion alone, but by faith woven into its most intimate spaces. At the same time, the framing of morality served to mask the harsh realities. The first concubine may have been praised as divinely chosen, but she remained a woman taken from her former life, bound to a system she did not choose. The religious justification of concubinage allowed the dynasty to claim virtue while still practicing control, and she, intelligent enough to see the contradiction, carried it in silence. Her prayers each night may have mingled gratitude with grief, hope with resignation. This duality, sacred and profane, piety and politics, became the template for the harem itself. Later centuries would see women like Hurrem Sultan and Kosem Sultan walking the same line, cloaking their immense political influence in the language of faith. But it began here, with the first concubine, who lived daily as both sinner and saint in the eyes of those who judged her. So when you think of her now, don't see only the silks and jewels. Picture her kneeling on a prayer rug before dawn, whispering verses with eyes closed, the glow of a lamp softening the lines of her face. Picture her lifting her hands in supplication, asking God to protect her son, to guard her place, to keep her from the envy of rivals. For in that quiet prayer lies the truth of her existence. A woman caught between heaven and empire, her morality scrutinized as closely as her beauty, her faith as vital to her survival as her favor with the Sultan. The palace never slept fully, but at night its pulse slowed, and you could hear the soft steps of eunuchs on patrol, the clatter of trays in distant kitchens, the faint sigh of wind against the latticed windows. In this half-silence lay another truth of the first concubine's existence, the architecture of control, because beyond politics, religion, or rivalry, the very stones and corridors of the harem were designed to shape her life, to confine, protect, and discipline her every move. If motherhood tied her fate to the dynasty, the walls tied her body to the palace itself. The early Ottoman harem in Bursa was not yet the monumental complex of Topkapi in Istanbul. It was smaller, attached to the main palace, but the principles of its design were already visible. The harem was a world within a world, layered with thresholds that only a few could cross. To step deeper inside was to step further into seclusion. For the first concubine, each doorway marked a limit, a boundary enforced not only by architecture but by armed loyalty. Picture the outer gates, massive wooden doors bound with iron, guarded by soldiers day and night. Beyond them, the palace opened into courtyards bustling with scribes, cooks, and janissaries. But the harem itself lay further in, accessible only through narrow corridors guarded by eunuchs. These men, loyal and watchful, stood as both barrier and bridge. Without their permission, no man, not even a vizier, could pass inside. The first concubine's life unfolded behind these gates, as if she had crossed into another world altogether. The harem's layout was deliberate. Rooms clustered around courtyards, each enclosed by high walls that kept the women unseen from the outside. Windows were latticed, carved with geometric patterns that let light in but blocked curious eyes. Corridors twisted like mazes, designed so that no outsider could glimpse the women directly. Even sound was muffled by thick carpets and hangings, so that laughter or music rarely carried beyond the inner chambers. This was architecture as discipline. Every step reminded her of her seclusion. Every wall echoed the message, "You belong here and nowhere else." Inside, the harem was divided by rank. Servants and lower-ranking women occupied outer rooms, close to the kitchens and baths. Higher-ranking concubines, including the first, lived deeper within, their chambers larger, adorned with embroidered cushions, polished brass lamps, and carpets from Persia. The Sultan's private quarters lay even further in, accessible through guarded doors that only a chosen few could enter. This layering mirrored the hierarchy of the harem itself. The deeper you lived, the closer you were to power. Control was not only spatial but also temporal. The architecture dictated routines. The baths opened at fixed hours, the dining halls at others. Movement through corridors was timed and monitored, so that certain groups of women never crossed paths unless intended. Even her steps to the garden, a small enclosed courtyard with cypress trees and fountains, were permitted only under supervision. The garden was both gift and cage, a glimpse of nature confined within walls, reminding her of the world she could no longer touch. The eunuchs were the living architecture of this control. Stationed at doors and crossroads, they carried keys to every chamber. Their presence was constant, silent figures with impassive faces, their very bodies symbols of the price of loyalty. The first concubine learned quickly that the walls confined her, but the eunuchs enforced her confinement. They decided when she could leave her chamber, who could visit her, even which messages or gifts reached her. Some she cultivated with kindness, others she avoided, but all of them reminded her daily that freedom was no longer hers. And yet, the harem was not only prison, it was also a place of safety. Outside the palace, women faced dangers of war, raids and poverty. Inside, the first concubine lived surrounded by guards and attendants, her meals assured, her chambers warmed in winter, her silks refreshed with each season. For all its confinement, the harem protected her from the chaos beyond the palace gates. The architecture, though it enclosed her, also wrapped her in a cocoon of order and security. But safety bred monotony. Imagine her walking the same corridors day after day, the same lamps flickering against the same stone. She traced familiar patterns on the carpets with her bare feet, leaned against the same latticed windows to glimpse only slices of sky. The architecture that protected her also gnawed at her spirit, pressing her into routines that dulled her mind. At times, the harem must have felt like a maze with no exit, a gilded cage built as much from silence as from stone. Privacy was an illusion. Even within her chamber, attendants lingered. Servants folded her robes, eunuchs guarded the door, tutors drilled her son. Every movement was observed, every sigh noted. If she whispered too long to a maid, rumors spread. If she lingered by a window, attendants reported her mood. The walls themselves seemed to carry ears. For the first concubine, this meant her composure had to be constant. Never a moment of carelessness, never a slip of temper. The architecture of control was not just physical, but psychological, shaping her behavior as surely as it shaped her space. Yet she adapted. She learned to use the architecture to her advantage. She knew which corridors echoed too loudly to permit private words, which courtyards allowed a moment of fresh air unseen, which baths muffled conversation beneath steam. She mapped the harem in her mind, not only as confinement, but as opportunity, navigating its layers with a strategist's eye. The same walls that caged her also gave her the tools to maneuver, to carve small freedoms where none were meant to exist. The design of the harem also carried symbolism. The first concubine may have noticed how the central courtyards often contained fountains, water flowing in endless circles. To the Ottomans, this symbolized purity, abundance, and divine blessing. But for her, it may have symbolized something else: the endless cycle of days, repeating with little change. The lattice work of the windows, geometric and endless, may have seemed to her a reflection of her own confinement, intricate, beautiful, but unyielding. The architecture, in its silence, became part of her inner world, shaping the metaphors through which she understood her life. Publicly, the architecture of the harem projected legitimacy. Visitors to the palace, ambassadors, governors, envoys, never entered its walls, but they saw the guards, the eunuchs, the sheer inaccessibility of the women's quarters. To them, the harem was proof of Ottoman order and discipline, a sign that the dynasty controlled its private life as tightly as its armies. The first concubine may have been unseen, but her absence from public view was itself a political statement. The dynasty's women were sacred, inviolate, beyond the reach of outsiders. At night, when she lay in her chamber, the sounds of the harem murmuring around her, she may have thought of freedom, of the world beyond these walls, the fields, markets, and streets she once knew. But she also knew that these walls, however confining, kept her safe from hunger, from violence, from the chaos of a world in flux. The architecture of control was not only her prison, it was her survival. So when you imagine her life now, don't picture only silks and jewels. Picture corridors twisting like mazes, eunuchs standing silent at doors, latticed windows cutting the sky into fragments. Picture her steps echoing on marble floors, her hand brushing carved wood as she moves through spaces designed to remind her of her place. For in the Ottoman harem, the walls themselves were as powerful as any rival, any favor, any prayer, and the first concubine lived every day within their grip. The palace gates swung open for more than soldiers and merchants. They also admitted ambassadors, envoys, and gifts, tangible tokens of diplomacy that threaded the Ottoman court into the fabric of neighboring kingdoms. And within the harem, the first concubine became an instrument of that diplomacy. Even though she never met an ambassador face to face, her role as the sultan's favored woman meant that treasures often flowed through her chamber, and the way she handled them echoed far beyond the walls of Bursa's palace. Diplomacy in the 14th century was rarely about ink on parchment alone. It was also about silks, jewels, spices, and carefully chosen women. Provinces and allies sent gifts to show loyalty. Rivals sent them to test goodwill. Sometimes those gifts were horses, rare manuscripts, or gold coins. Sometimes they were women themselves, daughters of nobles or captives groomed to serve as concubines. This practice, while unsettling to modern eyes, was considered ordinary politics then, and for the first concubine, every new arrival was both a rival and a reminder that her place in the Sultan's heart had diplomatic weight. Imagine the scene. The governor from Anatolia sends a train of camels to Bursa, laden with carpets, honey, and pomegranates. Among the gifts is a young woman, her hair braided with silver threads, presented as a token of loyalty. The palace scribes record her arrival, the eunuchs lead her into the women's quarters, and the first concubine hears whispers by evening. A gift for the sultan has arrived. She knows this is not just a test of beauty, it is a political signal. The governor bending his will to Murad's authority. The girl herself may have no voice in the matter, but her body is diplomacy incarnate. The first concubine did not always oppose these arrivals. Sometimes she accepted them with calm grace, recognizing that the dynasty's legitimacy depended on such gestures. At other times she viewed them as threats, for each gift had the potential to divert Murad's gaze. Her response mattered greatly. If she treated the newcomer with generosity, welcoming her into the harem, the gesture could ripple outward, showing that the palace itself accepted the governor's submission. If she treated the newcomer coldly, rumors of her jealousy could weaken her reputation, and by extension the sultan's honor. And then there were the material gifts themselves. The harem glittered with tokens from distant lands: Venetian glass, Genoese brocades, Persian carpets, Indian spices. The first concubine often became the recipient of such treasures, presented not directly by envoys but routed through eunuchs with careful ceremony. A jewel delivered to her chamber might later be worn when the sultan visited, signaling subtly that she acknowledged the envoy's gift. When he asked where she had received it, she could murmur, "It was sent in your honor, my lord, from those who serve you faithfully." In that moment, the jewel became more than decoration. It became a thread tying distant provinces to the palace. Sometimes she became the sender of gifts as well. A bolt of silk embroidered by her hand might travel out of the harem, carried by eunuchs as a token to a loyal governor or a victorious general. A vial of rose oil she prepared could be sent to a judge or scholar, cloaked as pious generosity. These gestures, though small, carried immense symbolism. They showed that the sultan's household was attentive, generous, and refined. The first concubine's hand, though hidden, reached outward through fabric and fragrance. Diplomacy also unfolded within the palace itself. During feasts and holy days, ambassadors never entered the harem, but they often caught glimpses of its influence. When the sultan distributed gifts on aid, the first concubine always received hers first. News of this spread quickly among courtiers and envoys. She is the favored one. An envoy, hoping to sway the sultan, might then send his gifts indirectly through her, believing her influence stronger than any vizier's counsel. In this way, she became a silent player in international politics, her chamber a crossroads of empire. And then there were the symbolic roles. On feast days, she might appear briefly in ceremonies inside the palace, veiled, distant, but visible enough that her presence was noted. The way she carried herself, the richness of her robes, the jewels she displayed all became signals to outsiders. Was she adorned with Venetian pearls? Then Venice was in favor. Was she perfumed with spices from Cairo? Then ties with the Mamluks were flourishing. Her body, adorned and veiled, became a diplomatic canvas. But diplomacy came with risks. Rivals in the harem could accuse her of favoritism, whispering that she smiled too warmly at gifts from one province, or that she secretly supported one faction over another. Eunuchs, too, could spread rumors, claiming she hoarded treasures or passed favors unfairly. A single accusation of corruption could weaken her standing, turning gifts into weapons against her. Thus, she had to manage diplomacy as carefully as she managed the sultan's moods, accepting generously, displaying modestly, and always cloaking her actions in loyalty to Murad. Picture her one evening, seated on cushions in her chamber. Before her lies a tray, a necklace of pearls from the Black Sea, a roll of silk dyed crimson in Venetian looms, and a box of dried figs glazed in honey. Attendants marvel at the treasures, but she remains serene. She selects the necklace, drapes it around her neck, and says quietly, "This I will wear tonight, when my lord visits." Her choice is deliberate. Tomorrow, when Murad asks where it came from, she will tell him, and in that moment, the distant envoy who sent it will know his gesture succeeded. The first concubine also embodied diplomacy through her refinement. She was trained not only to charm the Sultan but to reflect the empire's grandeur. When foreign envoys wrote reports about the Ottoman court, they often noted the elegance of the harem, the refinement of its women, the discipline of its routines. Though they never saw her directly, they knew of her influence, and their words painted her as a symbol of Ottoman strength. In this way, she became a diplomat without ever leaving her chamber. Diplomacy touched even her private rituals. When she embroidered, the patterns often carried political meaning. Tulips symbolizing Ottoman piety, roses symbolizing divine love, cypresses symbolizing eternal strength. To gift such embroidery to the Sultan, who might then pass it to a general or envoy, was to send a coded message of empire's values. Each stitch was not only art, but policy. But beneath all the silks and jewels, diplomacy weighed heavily. The first concubine may have longed at times for gifts not tied to politics. A simple token of affection, a flower plucked from a garden, a song sung without hidden meaning. Yet in her position, every object carried consequence. Even love itself was entangled with politics. Still, she endured, and more than endured, she mastered it. By accepting gifts with grace, by sending tokens with care, by embodying refinement as the empire's mirror, she shaped the Ottoman court's image to the outside world. The harem was hidden, but through her, it spoke. So when you imagine her now, don't see her only as the Sultan's companion. See her as a figure seated at the crossroads of diplomacy, her chamber filled with silks and perfumes from distant lands, her choices echoing across provinces and kingdoms. See her as the quiet hand behind treaties and alliances, the veiled woman whose touch on a necklace or stitch on silk could ripple outward into the world. For in the Ottoman Empire, diplomacy did not unfold only in council chambers or battlefields. It also unfolded in the quiet rooms of the harem, and the first concubine was its earliest voice. Time in the palace flowed like water through marble channels, steady, endless, and yet always eroding what it touched. For the first concubine, the greatest erosion was not in the stones, but in her own position. No matter how favoured she was, no matter how finely she played the lute or how sweetly she whispered counsel into Murad's ear, she could not escape the cycle that every woman of the harem faced: decline and replacement. The system itself was designed to ensure it. The Ottoman dynasty depended on concubines to bear heirs, but tradition restricted each woman to only one son. Once she had given birth, her role shifted permanently. She was removed from the Sultan's bed to prevent her from monopolizing influence. Her intimacy traded for the authority of motherhood. At first, this seemed like a reward. She gained her own quarters, attendance, and respect. But it was also a slow exile. The intimacy that had made her powerful slipped away, and rivals took her place beside the Sultan. For the first concubine, this transition was sharper than for those who came after, because she had no model to follow. She was the first to experience what it meant to move from favoured companion to mother on the sidelines. At first, she must have clung to her authority, reminding attendants of her precedence, reminding the eunuchs of her influence. But as new women entered, fresh and eager, her centrality dimmed. Imagine her watching one evening as the eunuchs guided a new concubine into the inner chambers. The girl is younger, her eyes bright with ambition, her silks newly perfumed. The Sultan's gaze lingers, and the first concubine feels the air shift. The room seems smaller, her cushions less soft, her perfume less sweet. She does not speak her fear aloud, but she feels it, the knowledge that favour is fleeting. Decline did not mean abandonment, at least not at once. As mother of a prince, she still carried weight. Her son's survival ensured her a degree of respect, and she often presided over his upbringing. With fierce devotion, she oversaw his tutors, his diet, his clothing, even his play. Her authority grew within that small circle. Other women whispered, envied, and sometimes tried to undermine her, but as long as her son thrived, she had a shield. Yet, even that shield was fragile. If her son sickened, her status faltered. If he died, her influence collapsed overnight. The harem, with all its silks and perfumes, could be merciless. Women whose sons died were often quietly set aside, their jewels stripped, their chambers reassigned. Some were married off to lesser officials. Their days of power ended in obscurity. Others lived in shadowed corners of the palace, their names fading from memory. The first concubine knew this fate loomed over her. Each cough from her son, each fever that swept the harem, struck her heart with terror. Replacement was not always cruel in action, but it was cruel in feeling. To see another woman wear the jewels once given to you, to hear music played for another's laughter, to watch the sultan's shadow fall across a chamber that used to be yours. These were the true punishments of the harem. No guard raised a hand against her, no judge condemned her, but the silent erosion of favor was enough to hollow her spirit. The system itself encouraged this. The sultan, like all rulers, had to produce multiple heirs to secure the dynasty. New concubines ensured variety, spread risk, and prevented any one woman from ruling through monopoly. This pragmatic rule became a personal torment for those like the first concubine, who saw their replacements not as symbols of stability, but as rivals stealing their place. And yet she understood it. She knew she was part of a structure larger than herself, that her decline was not betrayal but inevitability. Still, inevitability did not make it painless. Picture her now in her chamber, once filled with jewels and music, now quieter, her attendants fewer. She hears laughter from the inner rooms, laughter that once belonged to her evenings. She smells perfume drifting from a corridor, a scent the sultan used to associate with her, but now associates with another. She presses her fingers against the carved wood of her window lattice and closes her eyes. She does not weep. Composure remains her armor, but inside she feels the ache of being replaced. Some women found ways to soften this decline, by aligning themselves with powerful eunuchs, by building networks of loyalty among attendants, by presenting themselves as models of piety. They preserved a degree of respect. The first concubine likely tried these strategies. She gave alms, prayed visibly, cultivated alliances. She reminded the palace that she was not only the sultan's former companion, but also the mother of his son, the woman who had given the dynasty its first true heir. But she also knew whispers could undo her. Rivals might accuse her of clinging too tightly to influence, of meddling in affairs meant for others. Eunuchs might shift their loyalty to newer women, leaving her isolated. Even her own attendants might drift away, sensing that her star was fading. In the harem, decline was not sudden but gradual. A slow leaking of authority, a steady dimming of light, and sometimes decline ended brutally. History records that concubines who overstepped, who became too ambitious after their replacement, were quietly removed. Some were married off to distant provinces, given to officials as wives. Others simply vanished from chronicles, their names unrecorded, their fate unknown. The first concubine's ending is uncertain. Perhaps she lived out her days quietly in Bursa, watching her son grow. Perhaps she was transferred to Edirne when the capital shifted, her influence waning in new surroundings. Or perhaps she faded into anonymity, remembered only as the first, her name lost while her role endured. Her decline, however, was not without meaning. In losing her favor, she set the pattern for all who would follow. Later concubines understood that their glory would be temporary, that decline was inevitable, but that motherhood could preserve their legacy. The cycle of rise, favor, replacement, and decline became the rhythm of the harem itself, a rhythm first played out in her life. And even in decline, she left traces. The architecture of the harem bore her imprint. The routines of baths, prayers, and meals had been shaped around her. The sultan's understanding of intimacy, counsel, and companionship had been defined by her. The hierarchy of women, the rules of succession, the patterns of envy, all of these carried her shadow. Though her silks faded, her influence lingered. So when you picture her at the twilight of her influence, imagine her seated quietly on cushions, her son playing nearby, her eyes distant as laughter echoes from the chambers of newer favorites. She does not rage, does not cry. She accepts the cycle, even as it wounds her, for she knows she has already shaped the future. Not only by bearing a son, but by carving the first path through the labyrinth of the harem. Others will follow, stronger, more famous, more ruthless. But she was the first, and even in decline, that truth remains unshakable. Decline was inevitable, yes, but legacy was more enduring than any perfume lingering in her chamber. The first concubine may have passed into obscurity, her name lost, her story blurred by centuries of rumor and silence. Yet the imprint she left shaped the Ottoman dynasty for generations. To speak of her is not to conjure one woman alone, but to uncover the beginnings of a system that grew into one of the most powerful female institutions in early modern history, the Ottoman Harem. Her legacy was twofold. On one side, it was personal. The example she set, the survival she carved, the way she balanced favor, motherhood, piety, and decline. On the other side, it was structural. The precedent she created, the rules and rituals that outlived her body and became the very skeleton of the harem. Together, these threads wove the model that later concubines and mothers of sultans would follow, perfect and transform into dynastic power. Start with her personal legacy. She was the first to show how a concubine could gain and keep the sultan's favor, not only through beauty but through wit, composure, and careful timing. She demonstrated that silences could be as powerful as words, that whispers could bend the course of councils, that motherhood was not just intimacy but politics. Later women, from the famous harem sultan, Roxolana, in the 16th century, to Kosem Sultan in the 17th, would walk in her footsteps, wielding power behind veils. But their path was lit by the small flame she carried first. Her survival through rivalry set another precedent. She proved that composure was armor, that dignity disarmed enemies more effectively than anger. She showed that influence did not require shouting or scheming openly, but could be sustained through calm, watchful patience. This survival strategy became part of the harem's ethos. Women who came after her knew that to endure was to master silence, to smile when mocked, to bow when envied, and to let their rivals burn themselves out. Her role as mother of a prince became her most enduring personal legacy. The custom that each concubine bore only one son hardened after her, shaping the rhythm of the dynasty. The title of Valid Sultan, which later gave mothers of reigning sultans immense political authority, had its roots in her quiet authority as mother of Murad's child. Even without the title, she embodied the idea that motherhood elevated a woman beyond the transient favor of the bed into the permanence of dynastic legitimacy. Now, consider her structural legacy. The very architecture of the harem bore her mark. The layering of rooms, the hierarchy of women, the role of eunuchs as gatekeepers, all of these were set in motion during her years. The Ottomans refined and expanded them later, but the blueprint was drawn in her time. Her daily routines, prayers at dawn, baths at midday, music in the evening, became institutional rhythms, repeated for centuries. What she lived as routine, the empire preserved as tradition. Even diplomacy bore her shadow. The gifts she received, the embroidery she offered, the perfume she wore, these were not trivial ornaments. They were the first signs that the harem could serve as a diplomatic stage, even from behind veils. Later, when European ambassadors feared the influence of women like Roxolana, when Venetian reports described the Sultana shaping treaties, they were witnessing an evolution of a process that began with the first concubine's chamber in Bursa. Her legacy also lay in the paradox she embodied. She was at once confined and powerful, hidden and central, invisible to the public eye, yet essential to the dynasty's survival. That paradox defined the Ottoman harem for centuries. Outsiders misunderstood it as pure decadence, but inside the empire, it was recognized as a crucible of legitimacy. The first concubine lived that paradox daily, and by surviving it, she etched it into the DNA of Ottoman rule. Her name may be forgotten, but her role endures. Every famous woman of the Ottoman harem, from Mahidevran to Nurbanu, from Safiye to Kosem, walked a path she first carved. Every silk-draped chamber in Topkapi's labyrinth carried echoes of her modest rooms in Bursa. Every decision whispered at night into a sultan's ear carried the memory of her first tentative words to Murad. She was the origin point, the prototype, the beginning. And perhaps most poignantly, her legacy lay not in power alone, but in resilience. She endured captivity, training, rivalry, motherhood, decline, and eventual obscurity, Yet in enduring, she gave the dynasty the framework it needed to survive for centuries. Her life was not celebrated in poems, not immortalized in chronicles, but it shaped the empire as surely as any battle won or treaty signed. Now, as the lamps in Bursa's palace dim in your imagination, and the corridors fall silent, picture her one last time. She sits by a latticed window, the moonlight tracing patterns across her face. Her son sleeps nearby, his small breath steady, his future uncertain. She gazes outward, not at the city below. She cannot see it, but at the sliver of sky above, the only freedom left to her. She exhales slowly, perhaps knowing her time in favor has passed, yet also knowing that her role has already been written into the empire's bones. The wind rattles the lattice, the fountain in the courtyard murmurs softly, and her legacy seeps quietly into history. The Ottomans will rise higher, conquer Constantinople, rule 3 continents. Their harems will swirl into vast labyrinths. Their concubines will wield power that shakes governments. But long before those grand stories, there was her, the first concubine, silent architect of a dynasty. And now, as you lie back listening to this tale, let the noise of rivalry, politics and decline soften. Let the palace fade into shadow, its corridors quiet, its lamps extinguished one by one. Imagine only the gentle sound of water flowing in a courtyard fountain, the cool touch of marble beneath your hand, the scent of rose oil lingering in the air. The story slows, the words stretch like long silken threads, weaving calm into your thoughts. You have walked with her through training, rivalry, favor, motherhood, decline, and legacy. You have heard her whispers echo into politics, her silks transform into diplomacy, her prayers steady the empire's morality, and now her voice fades, not in tragedy, but in calm acceptance. Her role is complete, her story at rest. So breathe slowly, deeply. The lamps go out one by one. The palace sleeps. The first concubine, nameless yet eternal, closes her eyes in your imagination. And you close yours too, drifting gently into your own quiet chambers of rest.